The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to this much anticipated episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast. I'm exhausted before even recording it, so it's going to be interesting to see where we get to by the end of the episode. Of course, the topic of this week's show will be the Thermal $1 million challenge and all of the reaction and insight and analysis that we can give. We'll also talk about some of the reaction from fans and stuff as well. I think it's safe to say that the majority did not enjoy this event and would suggest many, many changes to it. I know JR Hildebrand is alongside me and he's got his notebook at the ready after making some detailed notes from the race across the weekend. And I think the best way to do this is just to get into it. We thought we'd divide this up into some things that we liked from the event, some things that we didn't like at the event, maybe some suggestions for things we would have changed. And yeah, I guess we'll talk a little bit about the fan reaction as well to begin with. I guess, where should we start with this, JR? I guess if we're talking about the positives, I think, if anyone follows me on social media, they will have seen probably what I tweeted last night, but I basically said that I'm kind of upset with some of the maybe not so polite reaction that we've seen online, because I think IndyCar trying something new is really cool, and we don't see enough of that from IndyCar, in my opinion, and I think in yours as well, because you've talked about it on the podcast before. But I really don't want us to get into a situation where we kind of turn IndyCar off trying some of these new ideas and doing some different things because they're getting, really disrespectfully panned online because of what's happened over the course of this event. So, yeah, I guess we'll start there. What did you think of the kind of reaction to the event? And do you kind of share my opinion that this, I think it's been a little bit over the top, and it's kind of worrying precedent for, seeing some more of these kind of different ideas being thrown out there in the future?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that I was a little surprised, given that it's a non-championship event. It's sort of, like I guess there's sort of mixed reasons for why this event existed in the first place, which is probably part of the problem. That it's maybe not entirely, the series maybe for good reasons, I guess, maybe doesn't want to be 100% transparent about why we're having this race, and kind of exact why this race is this race. Like, why is it a thermal? Why isn't it something else? Why isn't it somewhere else? Why is it here? Why don't we just go back to Texas? Like, that's what a lot of, IndyCar fans, I think, are wondering or something. The reality of it is, like, these kind of weren't options. There's a business and financial component to, like, why these races end up being where they are. And that's true for any event on the schedule. But in this particular situation, there's only so many ways that you can financially justify having an event that's not a championship event. And so that sort of limits where you can hold it and how it fits into the calendar and all these kinds of things. So I guess with that in mind, we've got kind of a weird situation to start with, maybe, which is that not everybody's everybody, which is inclusive probably of drivers and teams and whatever, maybe in hindsight, you could say there's not enough communication about why we're doing this, basically, which allows for assumptions to start to be made and expectations to be had about what this is like. Why are we doing this? How is it going to work? What to expect from the outcome of it. So I guess that probably, to me, strikes me as like a just sort of baseline maybe issue with the whole thing. And even for IndyCar, I don't. This is just I guess kind of a general question, not something. Not this is not like a rhetorical question. Like, I think that there's something wrong. It's just sort of like, is it totally clear to IndyCar why we're having this event, even just from an internal perspective? Are we completely on the same page about why we're doing this, what we're trying to get out of it, and having clear expectations for clear kind of goals to be working towards with it? Or is this sort of just, you get the sense like maybe in some people's minds, this is just like a placeholder that we kind of need to have. And so, that may be, if that's the case, like, I'm not saying that that's the case. And I don't think that that's fundamentally from like the top down the case. But it's sort of, you end up just in like a weird middle ground for everybody, with an event like this. And so, and all the way down to the $1 million challenge, wherein the guy that wins the race only gets 500 grand. Like, that's even kind of a weird comms issue, just with the whole thing. So I guess I bring all that up sort of just to say, to start with, there's enough that's open for interpretation. There's a lot more than usual that's open for interpretation in terms of just why are we showing up to do this event in the first place. And I guess I would hypothesize that that's a part of why the reaction has been so all over the place, and why in a lot of ways I was also, I guess that's all sort of just to say, I was surprised. I think I didn't have a lot riding on this. Like, I was coming into this weekend thinking, I don't know, this is sort of interesting. I'm with you. Like, I was supportive of IndyCar doing this. Events like this, non-championship events, have been on my bingo card of things that I've suggested to IndyCar over the years. Like, that's always, in my mind, been in the context of, we should be finding ways to try more new stuff. And whether because of contractual reasons or just for having a little bit more freedom and flexibility outside the championship product. And I say contractual reasons, like if you have a non-championship event, you can do things outside of there. There are areas where you can, as a business or as a sanctioning body, be more free to try screwing around with different stuff. Because you maybe are not obligated to work in a certain way due to your, supplier or TV or whatever contracts. These are good sort of, I don't know, environments, I guess, to try to evolve the product. I guess that all being said, ultimately, like the fact that it was after the first race of the year probably doesn't help anybody look at it that way. And I think one of the general insights here is, even if you just looked at it from the perspective of the teams, which there was certainly some negative chatter from teams and team owners and whatever after the race. So take fans out of the whole equation. I think, one of the insights that you can draw from this is just whether it's fan reaction, team reaction, whatever, that given that it's not a points race, you really do have to find ways to have it be pretty polished, have it be a really clear reason to participate in it and be a part of it. And have there be enough of a, I don't know, and maybe part of that is there being more of a reward for being there, basically. But I guess I say all of that mainly just to say, I think had it been a little bit more clear why we were doing this and what the reasons for it and what the upside is supposed to be for being here doing this event, maybe we would have just all been a little bit more on the same page. Because there were certainly some things that, turned out just if you were just looking at this as another IndyCar event on the schedule, there was plenty to be sort of critical about. And it sort of felt like that was mainly what we were hearing about after the race. I guess it's always the case that, the critical voices are going to be the loudest ones. So, I did see a lot of, I did personally see a lot of, folks on Twitter or Instagram or whatever talking about how, in a general sense, they were supportive of IndyCar doing this. It just kind of didn't end up turning out to be quite as interesting as they would have hoped. Those are also the kinds of tweets that you just quickly, glance over and like don't come back to. So yeah, I'm with you. I guess I generally think that it will be unfortunate if it turns out that just the magnitude or the, loudness or the, amount of critical feedback makes IndyCar shy away from doing these kinds of things in the future.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of points you made, and I think I can probably expand on it in a kind of more direct way by saying that if NASCAR hadn't moved their Texas race, I don't think there's any chance we would have had this race as the second race of the season. There's in my mind, at least in my opinion, there's 0% chance that this race happens if NASCAR hadn't have moved its Texas race. We would have just gone back to Texas and IndyCar would have been looking at this kind of event for the pre or post season, perhaps at an international venue, which is something that's been discussed. But I agree with you in the sense that I think IndyCar have admitted, at least, that it's an experimental kind of event, but have they come out as directly as saying this event wouldn't have happened if we didn't have a mess in the calendar and we're going to totally experiment to the point where a lot of this is not going to work, guys, but stick with us because some of this is going to be like practical learning on the job and part of it isn't. And I think we live in a motorsport world where we expect everything to be perfect the minute it turns up. Like any time a series brings out a new car, it can't be unreliable or people lose their minds because it's not ready. It's not showing up in a prepared fashion. And there's obviously different levels to this. Like in the same way that you can criticize a series for bringing a car that doesn't work, that's fine. And you can criticize a series that doesn't have a perfect product at the first chance of offering in the case of this thermal challenge. But I think it's important to be constructive and I think, like you, I did see a lot of people who were constructive and did say that they were happy that this had been tried, but it just hadn't worked. But I feel like it's one of those things where this is such a departure from what IndyCar is used to, in at least in recent years anyway, that there was always going to be teething issues, and maybe that's not as clear to some people as it is to others. And there are definitely things I thought in the lead up, just looking at the rule book and like what they were doing with this event, that I thought that is just not going to work. Like, that is going to be bad. And if I can do that, then I'm fairly sure that some people in the paddock at least had looked at some of those things and considered it for what it was worth at face value. So I think you're right. I think many of the issues here were probably just that it wasn't clear enough that this was going to be like a totally experimental event that wasn't going to be, right first time. But I was just surprised by some of the aggressive kind of reaction to it, that especially for a non-championship event, that this is not ruined anyone's championship. Like, the worst thing this has done is caused some teams some damage that probably wouldn't have had that. Well, they wouldn't have had that damage if we hadn't have done this race. But I guess the flip side to that is we would have had well over a month without a race, and not just a month without a race, but a month without a race after the first race of the season. So you build up all this momentum to getting the season going after a long off season, and then you have a month and a half almost break before your second race of the season. Like, I'd say that's even more damaging to a championship than doing a experimental non-points race and it not working. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure people have different ones. I know people were a little bit upset about the track, JR, which I kind of wasn't. And I've written about this a little bit in a feature you can read over on the-race.com if you're interested. My kind of thoughts on how the event went, some things that I liked and some things that I didn't like. The track I thought was good, and I thought there was, if you knew where to look, there was some good racing, but the problems were more what we'll get to a little bit later on in terms of how the format was, how the final was formatted, and how the tyres were. Those were more problems in my opinion, and I thought the track raced relatively well. I know there's some people who are going to be so angry with me for saying that, but there were some good little dices in places, I thought, and I thought it was much more down to the format not working than the track being not a good IndyCar track. And I would happily watch a race there in the future, as long as it was the right length and they brought the right tyre compounds. I would happily watch a race in there in the future. What did you make of it?
Yeah, like, I'm totally selling that. Like, I guess there, yeah, just the whole, like, some of the comments like that around, people not liking the track, or feeling like it. I mean, obviously the whole thing had this kind of elitist, it had a little bit of an elitist vibe, particularly at the beginning, when it was like these super expensive packages to show up and be there and all this kind of stuff. But the reality of it is, like, most people are going to just watch this on TV. Like, it's not, this was never an event. I mean, again, I guess this sort of comes back to some of the points that we were talking about earlier, which is, are we adequately communicating the aspects of this that are experimental? And, like, we're caught in kind of I've had this conversation with a few people about totally, things that are unrelated to this recently, but, like, I'll give you a little, like, flavor of I think an issue that, manifested itself here, but exists within any company, within any business, within any sports endeavor, anything, which is, there are times when you have to be able to go out and, like, learn something new. Like, there's times where you have to, I'll just relate this directly to being a race car driver. Like, but this is, I think, hopefully you can kind of extrapolate the fact that this is the case for anybody in basically any job or any position, which is that you'll get to periods in your career or your, business or whatever, where you have to be able to kind of, like, be creative, stand back, have space to screw around with some things, to go do some research and discovery, whether that's, like, looking into stuff and not having to be under pressure to, like, solve a problem immediately, or do skill development without that needing to produce an immediate, like, improved outcome. that could be you're a basketball player and you got to work on your technique. You're a race car driver, you want to like work on the way you hit the brake pedal. You've got some in any of these realms, you've got a different mindset that you want to be able to bring to something. And so you have to be able to kind of like, figure that out. In those situations, you need to the way that you do that most effectively is by really holistically creating a like I don't know, like a learning space. Like you and everybody around you is in that mode that like we're here to like figure some things out. We're not going to be we're not going to heavily constrain ourselves to time to do that. We're not going to heavily constrain ourselves to there being any particular outcome. I'll give you an example from a race car driver's perspective. Like, we go to the simulator all the time. You hear about teams going to the simulator all the time. That's actually a great place for drive, although it ends up being mostly, every time I've ever been to a simulator for any team ever, it's always been heavily execution focused. That it's like, we're here to run through 50 different engineering items. The only reason that the driver is in the loop here is just to make sure that they have the same reaction to these things that we did in our non-driver in the loop simulation data. And so in that scenario, you're there to like, the driver is there and everybody is there to just like rip through a bunch of different execution performance oriented items, and your performance matters. Like, as the driver, you got to be able to put together a super repeatable lap time. Like, there's no room for you to be screwing around with other stuff, because that's throwing another variable into the mix of these things that you're trying to do. Whereas it's actually a really perfect environment and should at times be for a driver to get in and work on some things of their own. Okay, like I've played around with some different techniques, or I've seen some other driver, I've seen my teammate do these things. I want to try to, I want to spend half a day just working on that so I can develop a little muscle memory for turning in at a different rate, or hitting the brake pedal a different way, or kind of organizing your, the way that you're approaching your input strategy or something. But in those situations, everybody has to, if the driver wants to do that, so I want to come in and say, I just got to work on this. And part of this is just for me to figure it out and get a feel for it. You basically need to have like no expectations that that's going to immediately produce lap time. It's okay if that's sort of time boxed. Like, okay, we're going to work on this for half a day. So for the first half of the day, we're just not going to pay attention to whether this is faster or slower, or if I'm making more mistakes or screwing up more frequently or crashing the car in the simulator or like whatever. But that everybody else that's there, the engineer, the data guy, the person running the sim, whatever, they all have to be, if you've got a driver coach or whatever, they all have to kind of be on the same page also. Like, they have to be bought into the idea that, okay, for this period of time, at least, we're just not going to worry about what the outcome is here. Like, this is not a performance oriented bit of work that we're doing. We're going to help driver just maximize the, creative space that they have here to like figure some things out. As soon as any one of those people is expecting that you're going to develop performance, or is judging whether or not what you're doing is working before you've kind of completed this, your say task of experimentation, then the whole thing goes completely off the rails. Then like you don't end up really accomplishing, you usually don't end up accomplishing anything, because you have this kind of mashed up set of expectations of sort of what you're going to be getting out of these situations. And I feel like this is kind of an example of that, for the sanctioning body. Like, we're here to experiment, but it's not super clear exactly what we're experimenting on and why. So we've come up with this different format. We've come up with these different things. Has it been clearly stated to anybody that any of this stuff are really things that we're thinking about in some particular capacity for the future or for future events? Or is this kind of like, what it felt like to me was, we've we've just got to figure out something interesting to do here. And so that probably means we should mess around with the format, and maybe we can only have a certain number of cars on track at one time, or something like that. So we have to kind of play around with this, but it's not really coming at it strictly from a point of view like, and this is I guess the broader conversation for me, which is a little bit reflective just of kind of IndyCar. You've mentioned, a lot of people have mentioned it, like part of the reason this seems interesting in the first place is because it's not something we see very much. It's hardly something we see at all from IndyCar, and for that matter, it's hardly something you see from lots of sanctioning bodies. Like, it's not like IndyCar is alone in like not experimenting out in public view that often. But we're kind of in a place here where, because we don't do this very often, we're like really out of practice in doing things like this and trying new things and having much of a, having our own sort of, there's not a lot of intuition. I don't think we haven't built up a lot of intuition for how to do that in a way that keeps everybody engaged and keeps everybody on board and does all that stuff, because we just don't do it basically at all anyway. We've talked recently about, the car is basically 12 years old. The engine formula is the same. I mean, nothing is changing. I mean, that's in some respects that's unfair. Like we've obviously had aeroscreen, we've had some things get added to the car, and to your point, the expectations are always that those things just go swimmingly as soon as they happen. And for the most part, IndyCar has done a good job with that. But if you really think about it in the bigger scheme of things, like, those are not massive changes. They're not things that are going to, fundamentally like make the whole thing come crashing down, if they don't go exactly according to plan. They've happened over a long period of time. Like, we're just not in a mode as a sport, as a business, whatever, where we have, I feel like, where we're we have good reaction and good skills and all of this stuff for moving quickly, for changing things, for changing things quickly, adapting and reacting along the way. And so I guess all of that to me was present here, that it's basically just like we've got mixed expectations or mixed reasons for this whole thing happening in the first place. Differing points of view about what we're trying to get out of it, and kind of this, it's just, as an event, a tricky middle ground where, okay, we might be trying some new things here, but it turns out that people have the expectation, are going to be judging this like it's a real event and that we like completely have it sorted out. And so, just circling back to your point, which is like, again, without being able to really communicate what we're experimenting on and why we're experimenting on those things and why this is what it is, it's just leaving too many things open for interpretation, from the fan, from even teams and drivers, I think, frankly, in terms of what it all really ended up being.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Alex Palou had said that he wouldn't like to see this event return in the middle of the season. And I don't know if it was totally clear to him, or it's clear to IndyCar fans, or it's even clear to IndyCar that that's not really, something that's wanted. IndyCar doesn't want to do a non-points race as the second race of the season. That's not what's we're trying to achieve here. So the fact that he came out and said that made me think, does he know that this is not, I'm pretty sure he does know this is not what is expected, and that he's kind of hammering home the point that he doesn't want to see a non-points race happening in the season. But it just there's a lot of misinterpretation of things and not really understanding what certain things are about. People saying that thermal should be a points paying race on the calendar. I don't really see, someone who's much more familiar with the thermal facility can happily correct me on this, but there's so many things about thermal that doesn't open itself up to being an IndyCar race, in the sense that you can't have the number of fans that IndyCar are used to having attending the event, because it's it's maybe a private club is not the correct term to use, but it's a members club, so it's not built that way for X tens of thousands of fans. There's a lot of private security there. It's not an atmosphere that's necessarily welcoming to just normal IndyCar fans. It's not what the facility was designed or built for, and it's just not set up for that kind of race. So I don't think this has ever been considered. At least when thermal was first introduced as an IndyCar venue, when we were talking about testing, that it was obviously floated that it could be a race venue, but I think there was a lot of reservations there as to whether it would be and whether it could be. So I don't really see how the venue kind of suits being an IndyCar race. And for me, it felt more an experimental, let's try this and either run this event again at thermal in the off season, or used what we've learned here from this blueprint to create this event on another track elsewhere and polish the format.
Yeah, I think, and I guess back to your original, point that I sort of diverged from, in terms of the track and all I'm with you basically. I guess had this event gone better, and or we ended up with honestly, even if I think you just ended up with TV ratings, it'll be interesting to see what the ratings are for this. I don't think they're out yet, but
no.
If you hit the TV number, then maybe there's because it's thermal, because you manage to justify kind of the promoter fee. The promoter fee gets justified in a different way because it's one of these private tracks. I don't know exactly the ins and outs of the sort of economic equation for running an event here, because there's just a lot of different components to that basically. But that, I don't know. In that context, does every IndyCar race have to have a ton of fans there if it's a track or a venue that people like and will watch on TV? Not necessarily. It's not like every track that F1 has gone to over the course of many years. They've gone to a lot of tracks that the reasons for going to that place are not because they have a huge attending audience.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think that's a great model to follow? No. IndyCar is different from F1 in many ways because it is so accessible, and that's part of what makes it great. Whatever. But like, I'm also not, again, if we were all on the same page in terms of why we were doing one thing or another, and that you could sort of justify the logic behind having an event on the calendar that sort of didn't meet all the same criteria that every other event did. I'm generally speaking, take thermal as that event and these exact differences out of the equation. I don't fundamentally like have a problem with that. I think we're all here to like, we want IndyCar to succeed. I'm certainly of the opinion that like trying more different ways of trying to succeed is going to be a part of it ultimately succeeding. So I'm not going to be, I'm not going to like be overly judgmental about how they go about doing that and the different things that they at least try along the way. And I guess I would say just about the track and about the racing, this is kind of like, well, we did have really high tire deg, which is something that we typically think like tracks that have tire deg generate good races. It's not like it's any more difficult to pass here than it is at Laguna Seca or something. Like there's other tracks that we go to that are super hard, Barber or whatever. Like there's lots of tracks that we go to that are super hard to pass on that we don't just say like, oh, well, that's a terrible track for IndyCars. IndyCar fans, or lots of IndyCar fans at least, like love that we go to some of those places. I thought the racing was actually, I thought it was surprisingly good. Okay, like there was never any real challenge to the leaders in these events until you have a longer race with pit stops, and you kind of know that things are apples to apples. Like you might just not have that. And how many races have we seen Alex Palou just take off, like completely check out and leave the field from at other places that we're not left like bitching about it afterwards?
Mm-hmm.
So those are the types of things to me those are the things that I'm selling about the reaction to this event, and the track specifically is kind of like, well, again, like part of that probably is because I went into this I'm just going to treat this like everything is an experiment. So I have no expectations of whether it's going to go well or not. Obviously a lot of other people didn't, but I thought like the close quarter, I was surprised at how closely like a big train of cars could follow each other around the place. That was largely indicative of the fact that it had a lot to do with tires. Those are generally like, those are part of the, checkbox. Those are checkboxes on the list of criteria for having good IndyCar races. So,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Yeah, I think I sort of, it's funny when you kind of watch these things without paying attention to what people are saying, you're sort of thinking like, oh man, like we're going to come on the podcast and end up being super critical, and then you're like, oh no, like I feel like I'm on the other side of the spectrum here. Like I'm feeling like I need to stand up for kind of just like what was okay about this. Like I'm with everybody that like as an actual event, it would like the execution of this all together, and like there was lots of things that could have been better or done differently.
Yeah.
But I would hate the idea of like not ever doing something like this again just because we were not all on the same page in terms of what we were trying to get out of it going in,
Yeah, definitely. Let's rattle off a few more of those things that, I'll say some things that I like, Joe. You can say if you disagree or not. But I really like having the push to pass in qualifying. I thought that was a great idea. I thought it really worked quite well in the qualifying format, and I think I'd like to see that at other races through the year. I think that was something the drivers were. One of the things the drivers seem to be, I mean, I didn't speak to every single driver about this, but the ones that I did hear from were all kind of unanimously in favour in finding a way to kind of do this at some stage in the future in qualifying to basically offer something new in qualifying. And I think Scott McLaughlin was at pains to kind of say that qualifying's already great and really close in IndyCar, but the push to pass would, offer something a little bit different and give some drivers a chance to try some different things and do some different stuff. I liked the heat format in the sense of I liked having heat races and a final. I didn't like the format, but we'll get onto that a bit later on. I'm glad we tried that, because I don't want to say you get bored of having 17 races that are just like green flag to checkered flag, and like we can't really criticize like a main aspect of motorsport that we watch like week in, week out. It's obviously the format that allows us to watch motorsport and enjoy it, but I like the idea of mixing up race formats and trying something a little bit different with some of these races, so that we're not, especially as we had more and more races to calendars generally, not necessarily in IndyCar. I've been quite strict at sticking around 17, but you could see that potentially going up by 1 or 2 in the future. And we've seen IndyCar, we've seen Formula One push up to 24, obviously. And the more you add to these races, I think the more the more staleness can creep in, the more you can take away from the storyline of a championship, which is one of the things, I love NASCAR, and I would never, hate on NASCAR, because it's one of the first things that I watched as a kid, and still to this day, one of my favorite motorsports to watch. But the fact that there's so many races in the season does make trying to follow like a championship storyline quite difficult over the course of a year, I think, for someone who watches on the outside. So I'm kind of like very pro having some heat race type races if they're, designed properly and they work for the tracks that they're on and the cars that are being used. And also I kind of like the idea of fans being able to be, or the members of the club at least, being embedded in the teams, for the sense that obviously we've talked a lot about it has been talked a lot about online about how kind of we're going to this place where, there's $4 million condos, and there's a lot of wealthy people who get to, do something that they enjoy. And this is like a hobby type thing for them, a hobby type venue where they can store their cars and roll them out and have a lot of fun with them. And that's not necessarily relatable to, probably 90 to 95% of the IndyCar fan base who are watching at home on TV. And it was a little bit annoying, even for me, to be honest, at times where it felt like we were having the look at this amazing venue kind of rammed down our throats across the TV broadcast if you watched kind of many hours of it over the course of the weekend. I can put it with a little bit of like, look at Townsend Bell playing golf on race day as a bit of promotion for the venue. But like across the whole weekend, it did get quite sort of heavy if you were watching a lot of the coverage. But I think it's could potentially be a gateway into, can we do more things with fans to embed them into teams? Can we give them more insight? And this is already something that IndyCar does fantastically well. If you have been lucky enough to go and see lots of different motorsport championships out there, then you'll know that like the value for money that you get by paying for a pass to go and like stand in the pits in the Indy 500 is better than probably any other motorsport event or championship out there. Like there's some amazing things that IndyCar do to get fans closer, but as motorsport has got more and more complicated, and whether that's just in terms of like the engineering of things or like how we approach things, whether it's the preparation and the recovery times and physicality that drivers have kind of developed over the previous few years, like getting more people behind the scenes to see some of this stuff happening is only going to be great for explaining it to the wider community of like, look at how amazing all of this stuff is that you're not seeing normally, and like how do we get that out there? I think one of the ways you get that out there is by putting people in these positions where they can experience some of this stuff. And we're seeing more of these kind of like behind the scenes documentaries like 100 Days to Indy, and obviously F1's got Drive to Survive and stuff like that. We're seeing a bit more of the behind the scenes, but making it more accessible to fans and giving them more of an insight is cool. I know IndyCar did they put some people in a team in the Indy 500 a few years ago, and they've not been, it's not something that they're totally closed off to doing, like they've done it before. So it would be cool to see that kind of thing happening in the future. Any of those you want to pick up on, JR, before we move on to some of the more kind of negative sides of the event that we didn't like?
I guess I would say I would generally agree that I thought messing with the qualifying format just kind of in general was something that I was happy to see. I think that just for the sake of it, like we all, like there's always discussion about one lap qualifying, like just single car, single lap. That's in a way that's almost what this created for with push to pass. That it's kind of like you had one shot at it more or less. So you had to kind of get everything, but it was sort of a mixture of in some respects our current format where you got like multiple cars on track and it's still kind of busy, and so you can still, like if I think about how that manifests in again, like, why not just try it the way that they did to kind of see how that works? Maybe that informs you that like this is kind of unrealistic to really work, or we're going to have a particularly, now you have guys that kind of get their laps like screwed up or whatever, but at least they have another go at it because the tires aren't totally smoked and you don't have this, they haven't like wasted their push to pass or whatever, on a lap that they ended up catching traffic or whatever. So there's some things like that I think you have to think about this is a particularly long lap. There's, you think about that at St. Pete or something, and it's like, all right, this is, in some respects, this is a different scenario. So, but some interesting insights that were gained just from screwing around with it. I think, you allow guys to try something new when it ultimately like kind of doesn't matter that much because it's not a points race. You get some feedback from drivers and teams about how that went. Okay, if you did that, but the session was longer, if you did that, but whatever, you could kind of, you might be able to reverse engineer kind of how to think about that in a different context. An evolution of that I think would be interesting to see would basically just be, okay, let's just try. It's been a long time since any championship, we do it on ovals, I guess, but just one car, one lap at a time, goes out and does it with push to pass. These are things that are kind of like, I don't know. It's been a long time since IndyCar has done that with IndyCar tires, with IndyCar, on a road course, on a street course, whatever. Is this interesting? I'll sort of layer onto a couple of these things what I think you might need to also have for that to be interesting. Like, if you had that just all by itself in isolation, that may or may not be super interesting. And such was kind of the case. I felt like watching these qualifying sessions that it's still but this is basically because I think this for just regular IndyCar qualifying. So this broadly applies to all of it. And the more you have just a single car to be paying attention to, or cars that that they're on the lap because they're on push to pass, that they're going to be doing it. It matters more and more in those situations. That like the data analysis that goes along with the visual representation, the graphic representation of data analysis that goes into showcasing one driver's lap versus another driver's lap, where they're different, how they match up in different places, where they're tracking relative to like current pole speed, all of those things. Like, those are areas, in my opinion, that IndyCar absolutely needs to like level up, for us to be able to, as fans watching these events, for us to really be able to understand like what's interesting about what I'm watching here in a practice session, but certainly in a qualifying session. And so kind of the more you get into a situation, I just found myself thinking like the more you get into a situation where you can identify the lap that guys are going to set their qualifying time on, whether that's true single lap qualifying or it's kind of this quasi single lap thing like what we ended up with here. That just becomes like more and more important to kind of like be able to appreciate the guy that ends up on pole, like how did that happen relative to everybody else? Or as you're watching it, you're on board with somebody, being able to kind of understand like what's different about this lap compared to either somebody else or this guy's previous lap or whatever. That's a lot of, to me, there's a lot of, particularly given that all the cars are basically the same. And so they don't really visually do different things in different places. Like there's not these sort of macro differences in where performance comes from, like driver to driver, car to car. That's something to me that just feels like it's kind of missing anyway. And for some reason, it particularly stood out to me watching, this qualifying session. But I'm with you on the rest of it. Like I'm not really buying or selling heat races in a general sense. I certainly don't mind seeing them. It feels like the other types of racing where heat races really work are all I mean, they're all on dirt basically. So of some variety, whether it's rallycross or it's short track racing. Generally speaking, there are some pavement, there's pavement oval racing where it's like that. But I guess the point there is that it's all like really low grip. And so they're all situations where somehow the racing that you have pretty immediately in a very short, even for a very short period of time, is super intense. I guess I feel like for like downforce cars, that's just downforce cars on a road course. I'm just not sold that that's like really ever going to be super interesting. Like, I don't think the F1 sprint races are particularly interesting. Like, they've tried a bunch of different things and they just kind of feel like this is just like an extra race so that we can have an extra race. Like the reason for it is not because it's actually better than qualifying or something. It's just because it's more racing to have on track. I guess on those grounds, I'd be okay with heat races, for IndyCar, but I'm not sure that you're going to get a lot of people on board with that unless you manage to figure out a way to make it really interesting from a competition standpoint in a different way. I mean, I was kind of finding myself thinking like, if we're going to have heat races, then we should have standing starts for heat races. What are the things that we can do to make it so there's more likely to be like it's likely to be less processional, or that there's going to be at least some mix up of the order of cars. And even if we throw in the main race to kind of that mix, because it was more or less just, I mean, it was obviously like much shorter than an average race would be. Things like having a mandatory pit stop, having there be things that are not, I kind of like had in my notes, like, what if you had a Joker lap? But stuff like that, I can even appreciate, like, as much as I think that's imaginative and would be kind of fun to see. I can also appreciate that that's like that also in its own way, even though this is a thing that, if you watch rallycross, it's built into the product, is the idea that you have a Joker lap, really just for the sake of variability in terms of what's going on. And it creates for a little bit of extra, human choice, I guess, that's like on display. Like, you have to make a decision at some point about when you're going to do that. And, that sort of offsets against other guys, in a fairly overt way. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to pit on this lap instead of that lap. It's like, oh, I'm actually making this very overt decision to like take a completely different part of the racetrack for a lap strategically for some reason. That maybe is like too far outside the bounds of like what makes sense for IndyCar, but it sort of is just a general example of, if you have mandatory pit stops, if you had standing starts, there are these things that are not like super far out of the window, that just felt like, okay, like these could be little tweaks that if we are experimenting with like a slightly different format, that we are thinking maybe this comes into play at some point. How do we make it so that this is a little bit more unpredictable, basically, in terms of what goes on. So I guess I mean those are things ultimately that I guess are more suggestions or critiques than, but they sort of, I guess I bring them up here just to say, I think there's a number of things potentially that are just sort of an evolution of a baseline of things that I thought were actually kind of interesting that they tried over the course of this weekend that maybe just didn't like end up firing on all cylinders for some reason. That could amplify those differences in a positive way.
It's definitely not. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But as I said earlier, it's my belief, at least, that a lot of the way the rules were set up contributed to the format not working in the way it should have done, rather than heat racing not being suitable for IndyCar. I know that's not what you're saying. You're saying that there's pros and cons to it, and that you have to kind of live with some of the cons to get some of the pros, and that's, ultimately that's how it's going to work with any format, and what you have to kind of have to do. I felt like if we move on to some of the negatives to kind of explain some of those things, I guess, at least in my opinion, and other people might disagree, if you want to have close racing and encourage people to, well, at least encourage some unpredictability in the racing, having 9 hours of testing prior to said event is potentially the worst possible thing you could do. There's one of the, we said at the start of the show, there was a few things that I kind of saw in the rules that made me think this is not going to work. And you might look at testing and say that 9 hours of testing gives the teams at the back of the grid a bit of a chance to sort themselves out and maybe close the gap to the guys in front. But in my opinion, what realistically happens is that the guys who are at the front get further ahead and the guys who are at the back don't have the resources or the kind of, I don't want to use the word competency in the sense of like that the teams at the back of the IndyCar grid are incompetent, but they just don't have the resources and the level of resource, whether you're looking at people or money or equipment, whatever you kind of add into resources there, they just don't have enough to be able to close the gap to those bigger teams. And I think with the tires as well, you're just giving the drivers and teams so much knowledge of how the tire works and how it operates that if you have a degrading tire, like, don't let the drivers learn how to manage it like for 9 hours before the race, because they're going to learn how to manage it and then no one's going to be able to overtake, which is what happened in the final. So I think for me, the gap in the final was not a great idea. I understand why they did it, because they didn't want any fuel saving in the final, or at least that's my opinion and why they do it. And I know a few people have had the same opinion that I have. Some people much more intelligent than me as well. But I understand also trying to make the tyres degrade to create some interesting racing there and try to mix things up a bit. But I think it should have been a mandatory green flag pit stop. I think you would have avoided some of the guys kind of going to the back of the grid there, like we saw with Colton Herta. He was like 86 seconds behind at one point in that first 10-lap run, which just makes a bit of a mockery of the format. And that's no judgment on Colton. Even he admitted that it looked a bit silly in his kind of post-race interview there. And I don't think any of the drivers really want to drive around at like 50% saving tyres so that they can attack in the final. So, what's worse, saving fuel or saving tyres? Like, they're both just a version of the same thing. So, I think those are two things I saw. The other thing I meant to mention a bit earlier, because we were talking about it, was with the push to pass. I think I got panned for this as well by, I can't remember if it was someone on social media or someone on the feature that I'd wrote, but suggesting that the driver ahead shouldn't have push to pass and it should be a driver, like, basically work in a similar way to DRS, where a driver behind is like within a certain window and they get access to their push to pass, but the driver ahead can't use it to defend, because then you're just kind of like in a boat over the course of the final where everyone saves their push to pass to a point where they think they really need it, and then one of them uses it to attack and one of them uses it to defend, and it kind of just encourages status quo. And I know it runs out, but how often have we watched IndyCar races over the past few years? Let's just say, for example, as long as we've been doing this pod, where someone runs out of push to pass and loses a race because they've run out of push to pass. I can't think of a single instance of that happening over that period. The one that stands out to me is VK from a couple of years ago at Barber, where he pressed the wrong button when he should have been pressing the push to pass, and Pato O'Ward got past him. And you could argue maybe that cost him the race, but I still think Pato had enough pace at that point. But without going into, I think, 2022 Barber too much, because that's not what we're talking about here. It's obviously going to be a very controversial thing, because people don't want to see like DRS push button overtakes happening in IndyCar, and I totally get that. But I still feel like push to pass is different enough that if you disabled it for the guy in front, then if they are overtaken, then they then get to fight back with it if they're quick enough. And if they're not, then the driver who should have been ahead in the first place has probably got in front anyway. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess I think, there are some, like when we get into push to pass and DRS and all these kinds of things, I'm just going to sound like a broken record and say, like, just take more downforce off and add more power, and these things become like less of an issue.
I also would, I'd also would agree with that.
which frankly, like, those are to me kind of the types of things that like you want to use an event like this for, is like, okay, well, we don't really know what it's going to do. We don't know until we try it in an actual championship situation, or, not a championship situation, until we get to an actual venue that we're going to spend an entire weekend doing it in a bunch of different conditions, really what the cars are like if we just removed 30% more downforce on a road course. This would have been a good time to, not that this would have been like they should have done it, but this is the type of environment that's good to try things like that. Just see how it actually goes. Like what could it, the worst that can happen really is that just people don't like it, or it doesn't do the things that you think it's going to do or something. So, whatever at that point, like, especially coming to a track like this where people have no idea what the lap times are supposed to really be anyway,
if they haven't done 9 hours of testing prior to it happening.
Yeah. And maybe reduce the test same time a tad too. But,
just send them into qualifying with 30% less downforce as their first experience of being on the track there.
I think,
how would that not be the most fascinating thing to happen all season?
30-minute practice session or something,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think that's like outside the bounds of what's like really on offer for these kinds of things for IndyCar right now. That would be like the first thing if you just made JR Hildebrand president of the world, like that I'd do. But but so to talk about I get my point. My point in bringing that up is like any of these things in some respects are kind of gimmicky, just one way or the other, right?
Yeah, for sure.
That push to pass, I think, much less so because it's more strategic and it's And I think I'll disagree with you slightly in that I think like I like push to pass better than DRS because of the fact that it's not just this free pass to go blasting by somebody.
Oh yeah, that's what I was saying. That's my take on push to pass too.
Yeah. Okay. So the other people were saying, yeah, right. Okay. But I guess there's like there's a middle ground here to play around with, which is like, could you make it so that the car that's, a car that's being fought like in a DRS kind of situation, where your lead car is not close enough to the car in front of it to be, quote unquote, within passing range or something. However you would decide what that is. Following car is within some, reasonable gap. Could you make it so that the lead car just for the first 2 or 3 seconds out of the corner can't activate push to pass? So the following car, if they want to use it, they know they've got like a brief period of time off the corner that they could get on it prior to the car in front of them or something like that. Something that makes it so that it's not just like a freebie to go blasting by the car in front of you because they're completely helpless. But that if we just got into a situation that it's like you felt like because the tracks were going to, or the way that the cars are, or whatever, that you needed to adjust the way the push to pass worked or something. I read a comment on I don't know, it's like one of the forums or something. Somebody sent it to me that there was a suggestion from one of the fans that you could have unlimited pushes of push to pass, but that it was basically like Russian roulette, that at some point the engine was just going to blow up. And so you didn't know whether it was going to be the first time you used it or like the 10th time you used it.
Yeah.
And so you could use it as much as you wanted, but like you were playing with fire basically of like when the engine would explode over the course of the event.
Pato's worn out the button. The button's broke for Pato. He's like on it all the time. Polo won't touch it for the whole event. Polo hasn't gone near it. Yeah. Not interested.
Yeah. You'd at least get a little funny insight into like the risk-taking strategy of the drivers. But obviously that's, not a real suggestion. But I think, I guess we could talk. I mean, there's other things that I think, are worth digging into here. You mentioned earlier, like, the fact that the format was kind of at this event, and so that felt a little off brand, and just in terms of how it came across, on TV, if you were digging into all of the coverage and whatever, it was that a prerequisite just for having the whole thing get paid for and whatever, like maybe. So, again, like it's hard for me to like just be completely just looking at all of this stuff on the surface from that perspective. Like I'm probably willing to willing to accept a little bit of complexity to like why some of these things that we didn't, that we don't love about the way that they come across are the way that they are. But
Oh yeah,
I do think that,
for sure.
again, in the spirit of experimentation, like, there's a lot of focus on, building new fan base, and that it seems like the general attitude there is, trying to become more pop culture relevant. And those are a lot of the creators and the, it's just big followings and that kind of stuff that are invited to these types of things. To me, this type of thing is alternatively like a great option to just open the doors wide open again, because we don't have as much conflicting stuff in terms of the way that the contracts are, in terms of how exclusive we have to be, whatever, like just make it wide open for content creators of any kind. If the engineering explained guys want to come and show up, if creators from other parts of motorsport want to show up to like check out IndyCar to get an up close, make it. I think that to think that we're gonna get like a Drive to Survive effect from becoming pop culture relevant, and that's going to be the thing that gets IndyCar like back on the map in a big way or something, I think is sort of just like an indication that we don't really know ourselves quite well enough in terms of what the product is and what's interesting about it, and like who we can reach and who this is interesting to. And so I guess there's I think that there are, for future events like this, if they are ever to happen again, and maybe just from a more general attitude of experimenting a little bit, either with the product itself or just with how we kind of approach it. I guess I bring that up just to say, like, I do think that it's a mentality that we should be adopting more frequently, even around championship events, in terms of trying different things and trying new things. But that it kind of depends on having good outcomes, which I think is this event is sort of indicative of, or reflective of, just generally. Depends on really being in touch with and being passionate about what IndyCar is, doing that honestly and truthfully to know what it also is not in its current form, and being excited and therefore creative and imaginative about what it can be into the future and how you want to draw people into that. And so I think that's, to me, that to me, if there's anything generally that was a little bit of a, frustration sort of watching just the whole event weekend, was just feeling like there was a lot of ways to, a lot of ways to try to do that and more meaningfully. There was a lot of ways to be more creative, more imaginative, more thoughtful about, the way that some of this stuff worked. I also appreciate that that's hard to do, and we're not really in the flow of operating that way. So it's not necessarily to say that I had the expectation that it would be different than it was, but going forward, I think just broadly, it's important that IndyCar kind of can manage to shift its mindset away from being hyper execution oriented about exactly what it is right now, and just be a little bit more, find space to be a little more open itself to what might be the interesting versions of IndyCar in the future, and using opportunities like this to really purposefully test things in those directions.
A lot to get into there, JR. I think we'll have to save that for another episode. But I think the only other thing that we've not mentioned that I kind of wanted to talk about was the prize money. I just thought it didn't really work in the way it was. And it sounds ridiculous to kind of criticize someone offering $500,000 for a driver, because obviously that's awesome. But for me, I felt like the fact that Linus Lundqvist was the only rookie to get through to the final, and he earned the same amount of money as Romain Grosjean, who was taken out of the first heat race, is just like a bit silly, in my opinion. $23,000 for the level of achievement that Linus delivered seems a bit kind of Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. And I get like needing to pay 6th through 27th like a smaller amount of money to make the bigger amount of money work for everybody else. But like, why are we giving $500,000 to the winner and $350,000 to the person who finished second? Like, just like speaking out loud, I would have offered a lot less for second in the hopes that encourages someone to try and win the race as opposed to finish second. I mean, like Scott McLaughlin's had a pretty like, I don't want to say it was like an easy second place, but he wasn't really challenged from behind. He wasn't really challenging Alex Palou in front. And like, he's taken home $350,000. Like, he said he's going to pay off his mortgage with that. Like, that's a big payday for second place. And not to take anything away from...
Hey, guess what? Scott's not actually getting 350 grand out of this whole deal. Just to be totally clear.
Well, yeah, that's another aspect to get into.
That's saying the quiet part out loud here, but anyway.
No, we don't need to be quiet about that. If you're unsure of what JR's mentioning, then almost every driver, if not all of them, have stipulations in their contract whether if they have prize money, they have to split a certain amount with teams, and that amount can differ based on the team and the contract that they sign at the start of their deal. So none of these drivers will be taking home what it was written down on paper that they would be achieving. But I just think I'm not necessarily I'm not criticizing the amount of money for the winner, and I'm not criticizing the amount of money like offered, because it is a lot of money. But I just don't think the structure of how it works is like enough for the teams to make it like, if you just consider how much it cost like Ed Carpenter Racing to get from like Indy to Thermal with all of their like trucks and everything and just all of the logistics around that. Like, obviously they're not doing anything else at the minute because there's a month and a half gap between races, but like even just the logistical costs, I imagine, like I'm not sure if Thermal covered the logistical costs or IndyCar covered the logistical costs for this event for those people to come. But it just seems like the amount of effort that went into it was probably not worth it for like the $23,000 that the driver would have won, and then the percentage the team would take from that. And if you look at like, I mean, yeah, like that was a pretty damaged Grosjean car. I'm sure that would cost much more than $23,000 to repair. But yeah, I'm not sure it really worked in that in terms of the prize money.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to as maybe a general sign off, like I think probably based on the way that it went and hearing the way the team owners reacted, like the overall prize money needs to just be like 2x, at least to sort of make it feel, if we're relying on that alone, like if you were going to say like, we're just going to do this again and basically not change anything, in terms of how we're approaching it or what the reasons are for doing it, or, getting buy-in for some other reason, the prize money clearly, this sounds silly, but it's just the reality of it. Like the prize money just like wasn't enough to like substantially move the needle. And
I think people understand. It's 27 cars, isn't it? Like $1 million is a lot, but is it a lot across 27 cars?
Yeah,
like,
not really.
A big grid.
So yeah. So anyway, and I think the total purse was like 1.7 or something, but anyway, like long and short of it is yeah, there are some ways to, but I think, and again, I guess that's one of those things that I hope doesn't just get like lost in the mix of all this. Like there are ways to incentivize people for, in a weird way, there's ways to incentivize drivers for a lot less money. Like if I was walking around the paddock, I would have definitely been pulling a Travis Pastrana $1 bet for like whoever does the hugest burnout on the warm-up lap, I'm giving $1 to. Just whatever. Like there's lots of ways to sort of mildly incentivize lots of things going on if you kind of can game it the right way. And so I think that, that's one of the insights from this that's one of the insights I think that should be drawn out of this is, okay, the prize money structured just exactly the way that it was didn't really serve its function the way that you probably would have hoped. Right. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that like having a big purse event or, having prize money be a clear incentive, or whatever. I mean, I heard lots of people talking about how they should have paid something out for the rundown at the halfway point, basically like after the first 10 laps. Totally agree with that. Like that has the potential to change how you race if you can kind of manipulate that stuff in the right way. So, all of this requires doing a little bit of like, game theory or something on like what, what's actually going to move the needle and get people to operate in a different way. But these are not fundamentally super difficult. There's lots of examples out there of stuff like this. And so again, I think I just look at that, it was going to work or not. And there's sort of no way without better hunches or better intuition about how those things are going to work to go. And maybe that's something that you could find fault with, but generally speaking, you got to kind of try it to figure out what gets people to behave in a certain way with these types of things when you're changing when the incentives are not, it's a championship points paying event. So I think I'm ready to chalk that up to like, all right, well, don't do it the same way the next time, like change something, but let's keep trying,
If you are going to bet on a driver to do the longest burnout in a race, please gamble responsibly. I feel like we should also point out and apologise to Alex Palou for not really speaking about him a whole lot, given that he absolutely wiped the floor with the field over the course of that event.
Yeah.
Two things in response to that. I'm sure Alex Palou doesn't care how much we talk about him. And secondly, I'm sure we'll be talking about him a lot over the course of the rest of the season anyway, so I'm sure he won't mind too much. That's all for this week's episode. Make sure you head over to the-race.com where you can find my feature that I mentioned earlier, a column on what I thought of thermal. You can go and read that and shout at the clouds and get really angry at it. You can even comment if you're a part of the race members club. Let me know how bad it was. You can also reach me on social media. JR's on social media as well. Go and check him out. Yeah, the-race.com as well for all of your weekend action. I'm sure you enjoyed the MotoGP over the weekend, JR, with Pecco Bagnaia and Marc Marquez coming together, so you can read a lot more about that race won by Jorge Martin, or Carlos Sainz winning for Ferrari as well. So we've had a much earlier end to Red Bull's dominance in F1 than we did last year when Carlos won in Singapore. So yeah, plenty of interesting stuff going on there. But for now, we'll be back with another episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.